time. Therefore, the question is that this House do now adjourn.
Kitchener Centre.
Madam Speaker, I'm back tonight to continue to call for action from the federal government in the face of an ongoing genocide in Gaza, one that's been documented and affirmed by experts, including the University Network on Human Rights, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Situation of Human Rights in the Occupied Palestinian Territories, and by the UN Special Committee. A few weeks ago, in question period, I spoke of an IDF missile strike that had burned Palestinians alive at a hospital tent camp. In the time since, Gaza now has the highest number of child amputees per capita in the world. More aid workers have been killed, and as a result, aid organizations like World Central Kitchen have had to pause their operations in Gaza altogether. 1.1 million in Gaza face catastrophic hunger. UN officials say there are no safe areas in Gaza, and nearly 70% of the over 44,000 killed are women and children. In the face of all of this, the world must not sit idly by. Canada must not sit idly by. Yet today we remain complicit, and the calls to act continue to echo across the country. Just this morning, 100 Jewish Canadians occupied the Confederation building on Parliament Hill, demanding the Government of Canada end its complicity in this genocide. Here are the words of one of the organizers, Neil Ricardo, quote, "Our politicians cannot be complacent in these marble hallways while Israel continues to burn Palestinians alive in their tents." Neil is right. Meanwhile, Dr. Mohammed Awad, coordinator of the Coalition of Canadian Palestinian Organizations, recently said at committee, quote, "The Palestinian people have been failed several times, more and more by the international community, and unfortunately by Canada as well." There is much the Government of Canada could do today if it were serious about ending its complicity in this genocide. At the bare minimum, it could start by enacting a true two-way arms embargo on Israel and cancelling all active military export permits to the country. Secondly, Canada could today recognize the state of Palestine, which should be self-evident if Canada believes in, and it says it does by its foreign policy, in a two-state solution. How can we possibly believe in a two-state solution if Canada doesn't affirm that one of the two states even exists? This at a time when experts have shared at committee in recent months that this is obviously a critical step for peace and preservation in the region. Canada can and should call for an end to the occupation of Palestinian territories. This government could fix the temporary resident visa program for Palestinian Canadian family members looking to get out of Gaza, following Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East's recent report showing that this program was intended to fail. We could follow through on our Geneva Convention obligations, including preventing genocide, and we could sanction extremist cabinet ministers who've said, for example, that starving civilians in Gaza might be justified, or have said that perpetrators of settler violence are heroes. Years from now, Madam Speaker, no doubt politicians will come together to memorialize the genocide in Gaza. But more important than those words of memoriam in future years is action right now. And so tonight, of the Parliamentary Secretary, I ask again, when will this government's words align with its actions when it says with its words, never again?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister for Foreign Affairs.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Let me begin by thanking the member for Kitchener Centre for his question and his ongoing attention to this subject. We too share his immense sense of grief, and our hearts break for the tragic loss of civilian life in Israel and Gaza. In particular, Madam Speaker, we grieve for the children who've been disproportionately affected by this ongoing conflict. But let us also acknowledge that this debate is taking place after a ceasefire was secured between Israel and Hezbollah. Though we remain horrified by the loss of civilian life in Lebanon and northern Israel, this ceasefire is the product of tireless and creative diplomacy. As our world becomes increasingly unstable, Direct diplomatic engagement remains the most productive tool in building peace. Of course, the horrific attacks by Hamas against Israeli citizens on October 7th still shocks us all. We continue to unequivocally condemn Hamas, a listed terrorist organization. We will never forget the pain and suffering caused by their heinous acts of violence. Canada also condemns Hamas's unacceptable treatment of hostages. We continue to call for not only the immediate and unconditional release of all remaining hostages, but also the return of the bodies of hostages killed in Gaza. Madam Speaker, what has been happening in Gaza is catastrophic. The humanitarian situation was already dire. Civilians in Gaza have nowhere else to go, and as the Minister has said, asking them to move again is unacceptable. The violence must stop. Canada has been calling for an immediate, sustainable ceasefire for months. But this cannot be one-sided. Hamas must lay down its arms. And also, Madam Speaker, humanitarian aid must urgently be increased and sustained. The need for humanitarian assistance in Gaza has never been greater. Rapid, safe, and unimpeded humanitarian relief must be provided to civilians. Canada was the first G7 country to act, and we will continue to work with partners towards ensuring the sustained access of humanitarian assistance for civilians, including food, water, medical care, fuel and shelter, and access for humanitarian workers. Today, Canada has announced $215 million in humanitarian assistance to address the urgent needs of vulnerable civilians in this crisis. When it comes to UNRWA, we understand the vital role they play in delivering aid to Palestinian civilians. Legislation passed by the Israeli government aimed at revoking the privileges and immunities of UNRWA is cause of great concern. It is also critical that UNRWA continue its reform program, demonstrate its commitment to the principle of neutrality, and ensure that its activities remain entirely in line with its mandate. We continue to urge the Israeli government to abide by its international obligations and allow for a full, rapid, safe, and unhindered delivery of humanitarian assistance. Civilians continue to bear the brunt of the unfolding tragedy. Canada's commitment to life-saving humanitarian aid remains unwavering. We condemn the killing of civilians in Lebanon, Gaza, the West Bank, and Israel. We continue to insist that civilians be protected. Attacks on hospitals, aid delivery sites, and refugee camps have caused the deaths of dozens of civilians seeking refuge. When it comes to South Africa's case at the International Court of Justice, the Court has been clear on the provisional measures. Israel must ensure the delivery of basic services and essential humanitarian assistance and must protect civilians. The Court's decisions on provisional measures are binding. We've also seen, Madam Speaker, the expansion of settlements accelerating in the West Bank as settler violence continues. Madam Speaker, we continue to respond to the urgent needs.
The honourable member for Kitchener Centre.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I appreciate that the Parliamentary Secretary spoke of the importance of humanitarian aid getting into Gaza. She spoke of condemning civilians who've been murdered in Gaza. In light of that, though, what I've been calling for are what we've heard from activists across the country who are calling for Canada to resume its work as a peacemaker in the world. That if we are going to stand up in the face of this genocide in Gaza, we should be starting with calling for a true two-way arms embargo and following through on that. The Parliamentary Secretary and I have spoken about this in this place before, along with, as I shared earlier, recognizing the state of Palestine. In light of her comments tonight, will she be advocating inside of this government to ensure we have a true two-way arms embargo in place?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Canada is committed to lasting peace in the Middle East, including the creation of a Palestinian state living side by side in peace and security with Israel. And Canada is prepared to recognize a Palestinian state at the right time, conducive to a lasting peace, not necessarily as the last step along the path. But let me assure the honourable member, we remain fixated on this conflict. Just yesterday, my colleague, the member from Don Valley West, and also Parliamentary Secretary, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, delivered Canada's national address to the Cairo Ministerial to enhance humanitarian response in Gaza. The needs of civilians in Gaza are dire. That is why, on Friday, the government announced an additional $50 million in humanitarian assistance, raising the total to $215 million. Canada will continue to be there, Madam Speaker. We will work with our partners and allies. Madam Speaker, the violence must stop. Thank you.
The honourable member